Right, let's jump in. We'll jump in with our final guest speaker. So Tom Rand is here to join us. And Tom is managing partner of the recently closed Mars Clean Tech Fund, which is a privately backed, early stage $30 million investment fund located at the Mars Center, which he'll tell you about in Toronto. Very exciting area. Tom also helps lead Mars' role in Canadian clean tech ecosystems, working with colleagues in an advisory, I'm getting tired too, talking to my, advisory services group to support the growing portfolio of clean tech ventures. The rest of his bio's there. So I'm going to hand it over to Tom, who's going to talk for, again, 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll open it to questions before closing today's session. Tom.
10 or 15?
Yeah.
It's always dangerous to be between a crowd of people and their drinks. So I will go very quickly. I'm going to go very quickly because I'd rather have a Q&A, which is more interesting. And you also have a copy of my book, which a sponsor was so kind as to get each of you a copy. So I'm really going to cover a lot of territory very quickly. I would point out, though, one of the reasons, I'm sure we all know this metaphor of the frog in the pot of water and so on. And I use this metaphor not necessarily to be alarmist or paint sort of a very bleak picture, and this is a pretty savvy crowd, and I think we know how bleak the picture really is. But to really ask the question, just like that frog has, physiological constraints as to why that frog might get caught in that pot of water, what are the rules of the game that are locking us into climate paralysis, right? Our response to the climate crisis is, we're bailing out the Titanic with a teaspoon, really, and I think this crowd probably knows that, so I won't belabor that point. But the question is why, right? And I'm not interested in simply pointing fingers at the Koch brothers or Rex Murphy and say, there's these bad actors out there who don't get it. I'm more interested in what are the underlying tectonic plates? What's beneath the surface that are locking us into paralysis? Just like that frog, there's something in their DNA that locks them into paralysis as well. So I won't belabor the point about what's coming because I imagine this crowd knows what's coming. But I divide this into really 4 different areas. One is psychology, right? That there is a psychological barrier to both our leaders as well as the general public understanding what's at stake. There is sheer momentum in the system, which I think is the one I'm going to focus on today. As young leaders, this is the one you're going to probably deal with the most. There's physical momentum, institutional momentum, financial momentum, and that's the piece we really need to unlock. And then, of course, there's the markets. We sort of have an addiction in North America that, you don't touch the market or interfere in it unless you've got a really good argument to do so. But the market by itself, of course, will take us right off the climate cliff. And then we have sort of some economic models. I won't get into these, but the way in which we do a cost-benefit analysis on climate policy uses models that are woefully inadequate to do that job. And I won't get into details about that, but I'll point out some of those conclusions. So really, I'm just saying, look, this is a really hard thing to think about. The general public, even all of us, are in some mode of denial about this problem because it's bad enough that it's difficult to think about. And there are psychological rules, cognitive biases that are empirically tested and verifiable that make this particular problem really hard to think about. And momentum, well, it's really just we have a really big job to do. And it's like a really bad habit, fossil fuels, right? And, great parties have big hangovers, and this is going to be a hell of a hangover. The last 2 is really the market will steamroll us right off the cliff. And what the economic models conclude is it costs too much to do anything, so we sit on our asses, one more year. And that's simply not true, and I'll make that argument as well. So first of all, sirens are sort of beautiful women that sing songs of irresistible beauty, and sailors are drawn to these songs, and they crash upon the rocks of the cliff. Denial is a siren song. And by denial, I don't just mean people who say it's not true. There's certainly some of those still out there who refuse to accept the science. That's sort of active denial. I'm more worried, because you can respond to active denial. You can either sideline them or argue with them or something. Some people will just never come along into the 21st century. They'll never believe it. So you kind of leave that behind. What's more pervasive is what I call passive denial. And we are all, to some extent, in passive denial. This is where you accept the science. You accept that 6 degrees is warming if we don't do some radical changes in our energy system. Yet we go about our daily lives as if nothing were wrong, right? That's a kind of passive denial, right? It's the oil executive who just wants to drill one more well. It's the hockey mom who wants to take her kids to hockey in the SUV. And we're all just too damn busy to worry about existential crises, right? Even if those crises are real. That's passive denial. And that's much more pervasive, right? That we can accept the truth, we can accept what's happening, yet, life goes on, right? And if the entire civilization is at stake, which it is, I'm not going to make that argument here today, I think you know that, you would think there would be rioting in the streets, right? If you can riot over a hockey game, I mean, sure, you can riot over the end of the world, right? But we don't. So one of the problems we have, and I won't go into the details again, but our brains as neural networks, all our lives form connections. Tiger, roar, zoo, fun, tiger, zoo, tiger, scary, etc. And those connections are physically instantiated in our minds, right? So that we can make sense of the world, right? In open-endedly complex contexts, we can respond in ways computers can't. It's common sense, it's a worldview. So over our lives, we form deeply embedded worldviews that are unconscious, right? They work beneath the surface and they inform our reactions to new events, including questions like, do you think climate change is a bad thing or something like that, right? So this is a great big unconscious machine. It's really well articulated in Fast Thinking, Slow Thinking by Dan Kahneman, for those who've read that book. But the point I'm making this is we have worldviews, particularly in our culture, that climate change rubs up against, that it's incompatible with, right? Many people believe that human ingenuity is boundless, solves all problems, right? The future is better than the past, right? That's what progress is all about. Steady hand at the tiller, especially if you're in charge of infrastructure. Steady hand at the tiller, mate, right? The economy can grow forever. And most of all, hubris, right? Ever since Sir Francis Bacon made the point that with opposable thumbs and a rational mind, nature is ours, right? It is ours to control. And to a large extent, for the past 300 years, that's been true, right? Life is grand at the dawn of the 21st century for most of us, right? I flew here in a jet plane, right? We have lots of reason to think our hubris is well-founded. The challenge is we're probably smart enough to knock over the apple cart, but not smart enough to pick it back up, right? That's the challenge we have. All of these worldviews are deeply embedded in our unconscious and are all incompatible with acting as if climate change were real and dangerous, because it rubs up against these things. And your brain will kick out climate change as a sort of a form of action because it's incompatible with things that are deeply held and held very dear. Lest we think this is too academic, there are well-measured empirical cognitive biases that you can test. And this is not controversial in the slightest, by the way. So for example, we avoid cognitive effort. Right? Like any physical system, our brain will look for the easiest route. And when you talk about climate disruption, the first thing your brain does is say, scary, complicated, and it'll answer a different question, which is, how does climate change make you feel? Which is a question your unconscious can answer. And it makes you feel uncomfortable. And emotions play a primary role in unconscious thinking, in forming these worldviews. Emotions drive the whole show as we're forming these connections. There are others. I won't go into them. They're in the book. The default position is, can't be that bad because it makes me feel uncomfortable. Then I seek evidence that confirms that belief, confirmation bias, right? Lots of stuff in the blogosphere that will calm me down if I'm worried about climate change. Good-looking people, affecturistic. If you don't like the conclusion of an argument, then you won't believe the argument, right? So the point of all is we're not rational. And the point I'm going to make very quickly at the end of all of this, without getting into the rest of them, is that one of the mistakes we've made is thinking, well, if we just got the right information out there being, I don't know, in the media or public television shows or in popular culture, if the data was there, the people would respond. It's just not true because we're not rational. And I've given some quick examples of how we're not rational, but the mistake is being to say, the problem is simply the media. We don't have the right information out there, and that's wrong. The right information will not solve this problem. It will not convince people to act because we're not rational. What we need to wake the frog up is a new story of abundance. Because then you can make all those cognitive biases work in your favor. So you start out by talking about a future of clean energy abundance, and your unconscious mind likes it. So your default position will be, I'm interested. You have other peer groups and public leaders speaking about a future of clean energy abundance. Confirmation bias concurs with the conclusion. You like the conclusion, so the affect heuristic works in your favor. So there's a number of ways I can sort of go about this, and there's details that I won't get into now. All I'm talking about is good marketing, right? That's all I'm really talking about. So it's not news. But the point is, until we articulate a kind of future of clean energy abundance and make that a part of what we articulate within our organizations, to the general public, with our families, at the PTA, we're fighting against a deeply held fear, which is climate change, because it is scary. So you don't combat that with information about how bad it is, although you don't shy away from saying this is not optional, right? But you have to provide a route of optimism where community leaders engage in it, etc. Right? So that's the first piece, is that we can get around this psychology of denial by telling a new story, right? Telling a new story. So that's obvious to anybody who's ever done marketing, and that's all I'm talking about. But it's about time the good guys got as good at marketing as the bad guys. So the other piece that I would argue, and this I think is more important to this crowd, is the kind of, so the top left is like psychological momentum, right? How it's hard for our brains to figure this out and act on it. Big job, bad habit is the same thing at an institutional level, right? That we have lethargy, we have denial, we have momentum at an institutional level. And that's the thing that young professionals like yourselves are capable of affecting most directly. So this is the one I'm going to go into in some detail, maybe 5 or 10. And then we're going to, just signal me when we're, because I could go for a while, but I'll. So the problem is, of course, I didn't get here on a bike. Years ago, I got here on a bike. But today, I got here on a jet plane, right? Modern jet plane full of jet fuel. The fossil fuel party is a fantastic party. It's the single most important reason why human beings were able to pull themselves out of the muck and into the 21st century. And it's frightening to think about the world without cheap, abundant energy, right? Unconsciously, we are deeply worried about this party ending. But we all know the best parties have the worst hangovers, and that's what's coming, and that's the problem, right? So the first thing I think we need to acknowledge, and those on my end of the table, like the environmentalist clean tech people, have to acknowledge that this is a really beautiful piece of machinery that we've built, right? So the challenge for me is collaboration with the incumbents, right? The incumbents have to be part of the solution, and we have to acknowledge on the clean tech side how big this machine is and how hard it's going to be to replace. It's not the case, 1,000 points of light, get the bad guys out of the way, everyone will put solar panels on their roofs and we'll solve this problem. Absolute horseshit, right? This is the single biggest machine and most complicated machine human beings have ever built. To think we're going to rebuild it without the incumbents, without the big financial players, the big engineering firms, the big energy firms, is naive, right? So the first thing we need to do is acknowledge the sheer size of the machine that we've built and how valuable it is, right? Fossil fuel producers are not our enemy. They're serving a function. They've made life good in the 21st century, right? So they're not enemies. Some are, the Koch brothers, who obfuscate on climate science. So there are some bad actors, but the industry is not an enemy, right? The industry got us here, and I think we need to begin to acknowledge that. But the sheer momentum of this machine is absolutely enormous. And the challenge is, of course, that historically, when you're dealing with infrastructure, you change it very slowly. Right? The culture, for good reason, when you're dealing with keeping the lights on and keeping the factories humming, the culture is to change it very slowly. It has to be, because it's too risky to change it quickly. The challenge, of course, is we have to turn this ship now quickly, and a different kind of leadership is required. So how do we get that different, how do we motivate a different kind of leadership? And how do we enable those with their hands on the levers of our energy system, how do we motivate them and enable them to make these changes? That's the question, right? That's how we wake up the frog. I mean, Václav Smil has famously pointed out from the University of Manitoba, it takes 100 years for a new energy system to replace the old, even if it's better and cheaper, right? That's the nature of infrastructure. So all else being constant, we are historically determined, if all else is constant, it will take 100 years to replace fossil fuels with something else. We don't have 100 years. We have maybe 20. So the answer to that question is, well, all else can't be constant. Right? And this is where we need to change the rules of the game. If we don't change the rules of the game, then we will repeat what's happened in the past, and it will take infrastructure timescales to replace infrastructure. So I'll talk about how we change the rules of the game in a moment, but that's the point. You have to change the rules of the game to enable those who run infrastructure to avoid the historical trap of it taking 100 years to bring new technologies at scale into market. The other piece is financial motivation, right? Remember the movie I, Robot? Remember there's a novel by Isaac Asimov? The robot has a prime directive, right? The robot's prime directive is, I don't know, don't hurt humans or something. But he can never contravene that prime directive. Corporations have a prime directive. There is one prime directive for every corporation other than a charity, and that is make money. And no matter what the conscience of its CEO, no matter how well-meaning its board of directors, no matter how much they've acknowledged triple bottom lines and have made changes in their own footprint and done some stuff to incorporate triple bottom line thinking in their acting, they have one prime directive, and that is to make money. Even more, if they are a dedicated company that in their articles of incorporation, I'm a coal company, say, I cannot contravene my articles of incorporation which lays out how I'm going to make my money. So to expect a coal company not to fight to the bitter end to keep burning coal is naive. The great-grandson, I think, of the original Ford was the CEO of Ford Motor Company. I think it was the late 90s. And he wanted to, so he saw what the Japanese were doing and saying, I actually want to become a green car company. They called him Kermit. He was so green. He was a family member of the largest shareholder of that company. And he was told flat out, if you go in that direction, we as the board of directors have no choice but to fire you. We have a fiduciary obligation to all shareholders. And we are a car company designed to maximize profits. And unless I buy some arcane argument that you're making, I'm not going to change what I'm doing because I made a bunch of money yesterday. I'm going to make a bunch of money tomorrow. Don't get in our way. So there are structural rules around how corporations operate. Should be no surprise. But the point I'm making is this. Having a good conscience, raising consciousness amongst employees of a company, triple bottom line stuff is all good. But it ain't going to get the job done. Because there is a prime directive of every corporation in this world, and that is to make money. That's it. So how do you change the rules of the game so you can unlock that paralysis? Change the way they make money. And I'll get to that in a moment. Price carbon is the spoiler alert here. But unless you change the rules of the game so a coal company can make more money as a biofuels company or a wind company or a demand response utility or whatever, all they'll do is dabble. And they'll only dabble to the extent that it makes them more money. Like I look nicer in my annual reports, so I didn't scare my investors, or whatever. It will only be dabbling, right? So fundamentally, we have to change the rules of the game, right? And people have consciences, right? People who run these companies have they're not bad people, most of them. But they're hamstrung and unable to move in the direction they know as a person the company needs to move. Because a corporation does not have a conscience. It has a prime directive, right? So those who are leaders in our corporations who do have a conscience and want to move in the right direction, Duke Energy is a good company. Enbridge is a good company. These are thinking people. They need to be enabled to make that change. From within, sure, but from without. They need to operate in a changed economic system that allows them to make money doing the right thing. That's the bottom line. Last thing I would note on sort of momentum is, so do you remember Magnum PI? This is something, okay. So there's an episode of Magnum where Magnum gets thrown off the boat into the water by the bad guys. And his brawn and his brains is not enough to get him out of the problem he has, which he's being circled by a shark, right? So he's terrified. And he remembers a thing that his dad told him when he was a kid, when you get really, really scared, close your eyes, count to 10 really slowly, and when you open them, the big bad boogeyman will be gone. It was about monsters under his bed and stuff when he was a kid. So he does this. He counts to 10. It's TV, so the shark is gone, and it works. We're not on TV, and really what we're doing, I think institutionally, is closing our eyes, counting to 10, and hope it goes away, right? When we're developing new oil and gas assets, exploring to find new oil and gas assets, when we already know we can't burn what we have, right? The carbon, we have to leave 3/4 in the ground. So let's be generous and say we can burn half of our known reserves. When we're exploring for more reserves, but we know that we can only burn half that we have, it's a kind of willful blindness, right? There's a great book called Willful Blindness that talks a lot about this. So one thing that happens is people think that climate is other people's risks. Tom Steyer, hedge fund manager, you guys know Tom Steyer, an American who talks turkey about climate change, hedge fund billionaire. talks turkey about climate. And he said, like, I know a lot of hedge fund billionaires, my peers. I asked them about climate, and they just completely disengage. And one of them actually said to him, look, I live on the 19th floor in a beautiful condo, and my fridge is full of food. When that fridge ain't full of food, I'll worry about climate. So the climate risk is felt to be other people's risk by the people that lead our biggest institutions, our hedge fund, our pension funds. These are well-paid executives, right? But climate risk is something that happens on TV to poor people. We see them around in boats in their little villages, right? When Pakistan got flooded, it didn't affect us. That's a problem, right? Wall Street was Hurricane Sandy hitting Wall Street was so interesting because it crashed a party it wasn't supposed to be invited to, right? Wall Street is supposed to be impervious to those kinds of risks. The rising waters, are you kidding me? Calgary got flooded. Toronto got flooded. So this may change as it hits home, but when risk is felt to be someone else's risk, we don't act on it. We saw that in the financial crisis, right? People were playing with other people's money. The downside was not theirs. We saw what happened in the financial crisis. So one of the things we have to do is we have to make that risk felt by everybody, right? Food is a global commodity. If Pakistan runs out of food, it will affect Wall Street because Pakistan's a nuclear power. And as Gwynne Dyer has pointed out, nobody in human history has ever starved before they went to war. They go to war first. They have to find food. So if our corporate leaders don't think this is their problem, they're in for a wake-up call. And again, this is part of the conversation that we need to normalize, right? This is not an alarmist story. These aren't crazy thoughts. These are well-articulated analyses. Gwynne Dyer's on top of this, right? And these are the conversations we need to make normal inside our institutions, inside our peer groups, around the coffee table, around the water cooler, whatever. But the risk is ours to bear, right? Being wealthy does not isolate you from this risk. So how do you change this way? You change the rules of the game. So I'm going to very sort of quickly finish up with just some quick points because there's a lot of detail here. But these two, I think, are the points I wanted to emphasize, right? That we need to change the story about what we're doing. We need to emphasize that there is more energy from the sun, and energy storage is now so cheap that you can have storage plus renewables can beat coal and diesel. This year, we're building plants in Aruba, energy storage plants, coupling it with wind. And we'll be outbidding diesel providers on those contracts this year. No subsidies. There are lots of these stories. Morgan Solar will be in the market this year, finally, with their concentrated PV system, 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Woodland Biofuels in Sarnia have demonstrated they can make cellulosic ethanol cheaper than the gasoline it replaces. They'll be the lowest cost liquid fuel provider in North America, including the energy incumbents. So there are lots of ways for the energy incumbents to begin to think about a new class of low-carbon assets that can be developed, right? That are profitable, that don't contravene the prime directive of your companies. There is a future of clean energy abundance that is profitable. We need to find those stories and emphasize them. And when we're inside the institutions that we work for, we need to make those institutions aware of the risks they're taking. But more importantly, I think, we need to enable them to change the rules of the game. We need to be actively asking for a price on carbon. Without that, we will not change the rules of the game. So very quickly, I have other comments about the market. The market is not something that finds equilibrium, contrary to the Chicago School. This is math left over from the 18th century when economics had science envy. And they thought they could use predictive analysis to watch the world unfold. Absolute nonsense. A better description of the economy is as a dynamic, complex, evolving thing, like a cell, like a vortex in water, like social networks. These are highly nonlinear, highly creative systems that evolve over time. And there's a kind of mathematics that describes it called dynamic evolving systems, dynamic complex systems. The point I'm making is this, though. When we talk about changing the rules of the game, the market is the single most powerful and creative force in human history. It cannot be predicted. You cannot predict what technologies will happen. It is highly creative, highly complex, recursive, self-referencing, very powerful. If you can have it work as an algorithm to solve for a particular variable, which is carbon, there is no other force as strong as that. So the left has to acknowledge that we must harness and acknowledge the market's power. But the right has to acknowledge that it has to be harnessed. Its creative potential is unmatched. But if it doesn't get harnessed, That creativity will figure out ways to get every last piece of coal out of the ground and into the sky. So when I talk about changing the rules, instead of the market being sort of steamrolling along, which it can do, it's a complex system, let it go, it'll solve all kinds of things. We define a variable for it to solve. Like gravity in this picture is defining where that water ends up. A price on carbon defines where the economy ends up, at a place of low carbon. It will solve for that problem in creative, interesting, complex ways. So we can't predict it in detail, but we can set a direction. And by setting a direction, putting a price on carbon, trillions of transactions every day are affected, from power plants to chocolate bars. And the economy as a whole will shift and solve the problem of carbon, right? That's what the market can do. But it will only do it if we tame it. So a price on carbon is not a left or right thing. A price on carbon is a practical and pragmatic way of understanding the strength and creativity of the market and unleashing it to solve a particular problem, which is carbon. I'm going to end there because I think we want time for Q&A. I'll make one more quick comment. Everyone knows cost-benefit analyses are good things to do. You would be naive not to do that when you're building a big project. The economic models that we use to do cost-benefit analysis on climate policy, even the authors of those models acknowledge that they're woefully inadequate. The science is dumbed down so much. There's no such thing as nonlinear recursive feedback in the science part of it. The discount rate is set such that no matter what happens in 2050 or 2100, it has no value today. We know what the discount rate is in this room. Discount rate for something 100 years from now will make almost anything irrelevant. And there are a number of other variables in these models that rig the answer to be don't do anything. And Nordhaus, the author of the models, admits this. There's a great story when I studied at the London School of Economics that Nancy Cartwright was fond of saying. Take a piece of paper. It's about this big. Drop it from the top of a building on a windy day and predict where it will end up. So you build a highly complex model that takes into account all kinds of stuff. It spits out numbers to the 10th decimal place, which is what those models do. They look really accurate. And you try to predict where that piece of paper will end up. You can't predict where that piece of paper is going to end up. Those models are garbage. They always will be garbage. They can't predict the future like that. You simply can't. We don't know what the causal chain of effect is from carbon emissions to fisheries damage in 2100. We cannot possibly know that. So let's admit it. But if you knew that that piece of paper was a 20-pound note, you know with near certainty it will end up in somebody's pocket. So the point I'm making is sometimes we use the wrong language to describe things. And sometimes everyday language, foggy generalizations, are more accurate than highly quantized models that purport to have precision. And when we talk about climate change, it's an existential threat. The language we should be using is how do we want to treat future generations? That's a question we might want to ask. So there's a different kind of language that we should admit is useful when we talk about threats as massive as climate change. Now, there are technical reasons why these models can be improved. I give them in the book, why we would pick a discount rate of a certain number, and so on. So I have more sophisticated responses. But in general, let's admit we can't predict the future. Let's admit that we have a big problem. Let's admit that intuitively we know what's happening. Everything's at stake. And so our response might be, let's buy insurance. And when we think about what that insurance costs, which is the cost of a carbon policy, again, I'll look to the book. I calculate the numbers. Using my opponents, Bjorn Lomborg, all the people that think we can't possibly solve this problem because it's too expensive, I use their numbers. And I assume there are no benefits. So saving our fisheries doesn't mean a thing. Keeping our bread baskets ain't worth a dime. There's no economic stimulus from rebuilding our energy systems. Nothing. There's no benefit from being more efficient so you can spend your money on something else other than gasoline for your car. No benefits at all. Just costs. Do you know what it costs to keep essentially our spaceship habitable? It costs about a coffee and a donut per day per person. That's using my opponent's numbers, who claim it's too expensive to keep warming to 2 degrees. If you talk about in absolute numbers, yeah, it's a lot, $30 or $40 trillion by 2030 or whatever. It's a lot of money. It's a coffee and a donut a day per person. Now, because, of course, people in the developing world can't afford as much coffee, we might have to buy maybe 3 extra donuts here in the developed world. That's what it costs to keep, essentially, our generation is being asked to pay this price, and we're told it's too much. And I don't know what your parents did, or your grandparents did, but humans have come through a lot of crap to get here. A lot of sacrifice to get here. This is our sacrifice. And we're somehow told this is too much to bear. I know what my grandmother would have to say about that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. Very passionate. Great. Great job. So we have time for a couple of questions. Who has a question? Is there one here? Over there?
Hi, thanks. I think most people in this room agree that a carbon tax is one of the most important policy instruments to make this change happen. Given the history of what's going on with certain political parties in terms of taking their stance against that, what does it mean for, because I think at this point it's a matter of sort of hypothesizing about how this plays out politically. What does this mean for political government, provincial and federal future governments to take this on? And I mean, if you had the ear of the opponents to the Conservative parties and stuff like that, who may be thinking about it but reluctant, what's your message to them?
Well, there was a poll done recently by Canada 2020. I don't know if anybody saw this. And it found that every party, no matter what party you support, a majority of every party wants a price on carbon. And that's about 50%. That number goes up when you identify the price. And so they put something like $25 a ton, and it was broad support across Canadians with 70-odd%. You can go to Canada2020.org and you can find the numbers. But there is popular support in every party to do this, including the Conservatives. So I think that's the first point I would make. But in a first-past-the-post system, you can differentiate yourself and rile up your base. And so I think the numbers get a lot more complicated then, because I don't know what internal machinations or what the base means for the Conservatives and how they. So I think it's a problem. I'm not hoping for anything from the feds. I think provinces can do it. There was a great article in The Economist that talked about BC and said BC has experienced a net benefit from their carbon tax. That's The Economist. So I think you can point to those sorts of localized taxes. The bigger argument is people say, well, how can one jurisdiction go it alone when another jurisdiction isn't, and doesn't that put you at a competitive disadvantage? I would argue there are $7 trillion of assets out there waiting for a low-carbon home. So if you articulate a price on carbon and you are clear about it, and so the risk is known, shadow pricing occurs already, right? All the smart energy companies have shadow pricing in there anyway. If you take away the shadow and you make it discrete, the risk is essentially quantified and understood. The only thing worse than a quantified risk is an unquantified risk, because you just don't know what it is, and it's harder to act. So I would argue jurisdictions that choose to quantify that risk can benefit from an inflow of capital when they look to build the infrastructure they need to meet targets they've set. I know that's a bit of a convoluted answer, but that's, yeah.
Question here? Yep. And one over here.
Thank you so much for your great talk. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the fact that BC is moving ahead with exempting shale gas developments from the carbon tax. And then also I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the future of either carbon tax or cap and trade, given that the EU ETS has kind of fallen apart.
Yeah, well, I don't think shale gas should be exempt from carbon tax. It's pretty simple. The problem with shale gas, well, there's two problems with it. One, I mean, it's of potential benefit, right? I would rather burn nat gas than coal. I'm fine, duh. But one problem is fugitive emissions, right? And they're beginning to be quantified now, and they're between 7 and 11%. So we're not further ahead burning nat gas than coal because of that methane. The other is that I think nat gas might be a progress trap, right? The progress trap is where every step you move looks like you're moving forward or gaining, but you hit a local minima, right? So you follow natural gas and you commit more infrastructure to natural gas, and you leave behind opportunities like solar and geothermal and all the rest of that kind of stuff. And because you've committed to this short-term gain, even if you buy the gain of a 50% drop in emissions, you're stuck now with a whole bunch of new infrastructure that you're not going to rebuild for 50 years, and you miss the boat on solar and geothermal and all the rest of it. So I think shale gas is a kind of a dangerous phenomenon. I mean, it's lucrative, it's happening, I get it, but it's the new bar that renewables have to meet, which is a very low bar in terms of price, or high bar in terms of price, depending how you view it. And the more we get distracted by that as a solution, they call it a bridge fuel. Well, I'm like, well, a bridge to where? If you can articulate where, then I'll buy it's a bridge, but I'm not hearing the where. Yeah.
There's one over here, I think.
Oh, yep. So if you take into account fugitive emissions, so if you think about it, you should have a super high carbon tax on fracked wells, because methane is 22 times more potent than carbon. So if you included the methane emissions, then I'm going to tax you at the same rate as if that was carbon dioxide equivalent, you wouldn't frack a well, right? True cost accounting. Yeah. Such a hip crowd, eh? You guys, true cost accounting. Everybody gets it.
Hi, Tom. Thank you for being here. Just wondering if you could give the people in this room your top 3 pieces of advice to take away.
Well, I covered a lot here. So as individuals or as young professionals? Well, as young professionals, the first thing I would argue is be really good at what you do. Everybody wants their hands on the levers of power, and you have to earn your right to do it. So if you're an accountant, if you're an engineer, if you're a lawyer, whatever you are, you have to be really good at what you do if you're planning on being, someone who plays with those levers, and you got to earn that right. So be good at what you do is the first one. The second one would be normalize these conversations, right? Everywhere. Like it's weird. My gardener pointed out to me that, she said, it's weird that the plants are, it's odd, isn't it? And I said, yeah, it's kind of odd. Do you think it's odd? You know more plants than me. And she said, oh, it's odd. And she said, you know what I find weirder, though? I asked her, what? And she said, without any prompting for me, she says, I find it really weird that nobody's talking about it. Like even her gardener friends sort of pass it off like a bit of a joke, but don't go any deeper. So normalizing these conversations, I think, would be a second good one. And what's my number 3? I don't know. Don't eat red meat or something.
One last question. You have one more question, anyway? Oh, behind you there.
A lot of issues today have revolved around policy and how change is going to come from the enforcement from policy. And I just wanted to know how we can effectively get the policy makers to change.
Well, that's the $1 million question, right? So I'm actually going to not answer that question, but I'll answer something else instead. Because you know what? We're in a first past the post system. I don't have any answers for that. I mean, it's a deep problem in Canada.
I'll throw out one.
Yeah.
Vote.
Yeah, vote.
Vote. You guys don't vote as much. Vote.
But I'll make one other point though, actually, because I'd like to take the opposite attack and say, yes, there are long-term solutions that require policy change, like a price on carbon, and vote, and be politically active, and yada, 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 to get that done. But I would also argue in the meantime, there are mature, ready-to-scale, clean tech solutions, I can name them, Morgan Solar, Woodland Biofuels, Hydrostore, that are competitive in the market today, that have a higher return, a higher IRR than a new oil and gas field, with lower long-term risk. I would argue those can be done without policy. And what's keeping them from being done is that for the incumbents, I made a bunch of money yesterday, I'm going to do the same thing today. I am not going to take political risk. Even if you show me a slightly sweeter return, it's risky for me as a person to do that. So when I say normalize these conversations, that also means that there are energy incumbents who could be partnering with clean tech startups, clean tech stars, to develop a new class of low-carbon energy assets, right? Like cellulosic ethanol plants. Woodland ethanol plants have a better rate of return than an oil and gas field with lower risk. Well, why aren't, Suncor partnering with Woodland? Habits of mind. It's habits of mind in the energy incumbents. Long before we get to a price on carbon, which we need eventually, and believe me, when we get it, it'll be low, it'll ramp up slowly, like it's not going to be a silver bullet. There's a ton of low-hanging fruit that has an IRR today that we're not doing. And we're not doing it because your bosses have habits of mind. They've made money before doing something. They're going to do the same thing. And they need to be convinced. They need to be told stories of clean energy abundance, of 25% IRR returns on de-risked commercial projects for cellulosic ethanol, better than an oil and gas field. So I would argue there's tons of stuff that can happen if the conversations that CFOs hear and are presented with by their bright spark employees might get us over that hump and start getting some more collaboration with the energy incumbents, because it's got to be a collaborative effort. That was my pitch.
Well, thank you from the group. You got a copy of Chris's? Have you got a copy of it?
I met Chris yesterday. No, I don't have a copy.
So, and this is from the group. Thank you very much for your inspirational talk. That was
Thanks
great.
very much. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity very much.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, so now we're down to the exciting stuff. The exciting part is announcing our winners, but I don't want to call the winners. They are winners, but all 4 of our young folks up here that came were fabulous. And so I'm going to say we're going to announce the 2 selected people for the session. But all 4 of them are actually getting an opportunity to meet with the Minister of Environment, so to engage and normalize that conversation tomorrow, which will be fascinating, because Minister Pollock is a very engaged politician and gets the climate issue here. So they're going to get that opportunity. But I wanted to make that announcement, and it was very tough. The judges found it very hard, as I think you did too when we did the voting and that. But I'd like to ask that Rosalind and Alima come up and join us for So congratulations. Thank you. I'm going to give you a book too. This is Chris's book, Rich Henderson. Yeah, thank you. And we're going to talk tomorrow about how we make it controversial. Thank you. And fun. We got to make this fun session. So I hope all of you are going to come out to this session on Thursday. I want to see you en masse and cheer these 2 very intelligent, bright young people to success and beating us old guys up. That'll be up there. So, okay, thanks very much. Thank you. All right, so some announcements. Still, no one's claimed their card. I'm getting this as a signal, but I'm not sure it's appropriate. So, anybody? 1911 Hyatt Regency. Hyatt Regency. No, right? Okay. All right, I'm leaving it there. Okay, just a couple of announcements before I bring Rachel back up on stage. So again, the aquarium, 25 people signed up, I believe, and my understanding is electronic tickets or paperless tickets. So those of you that signed up to go to the aquarium, just show up, show your name tag that you're from the Emerging Leaders, and you'll be allowed in. Anybody else who wants to go can go to the aquarium. Again, show their badge and that, and you'll get the special pricing to get into the aquarium. So that's 1. 2 is, and importantly, we want to thank our sponsors again. So first and foremost, Target. Is Kim still here? Is Kim? No, she's gone. So Target being our sponsor, again, our first platinum sponsor, and allowing us to broadcast this across the country and live stream it, which is just phenomenal. So Target, thank you. Gold, Suncor and Cenovus. Silver, Nexen and CN. Bronze, ConocoPhillips, Canadian Meg, Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada. Our contributing sponsors, TransCanada, Interface, Chemical Industry Association of Canada, Brookfield Johnson Control, West Coast Sightseeing, Sustainability Partners, Bullfrog Power, Carbon Zero, Dig Events, and Ethical Bean. Of course, the venue, SFU, so thank you for that. And our partner organization, of course, Connecting Environmental Professionals. And I also want to thank the Globe Foundation for also listening to us and starting to integrate you guys more into the conference. So big round of applause for all those sponsors. Okay, more importantly, I've tried several times to thank all our volunteers. No one ever around, everybody's around, so I want all the volunteers to come up, please. All the committee, advisory committee, organizing committee, and the volunteers today. All the way up. Come on up. Come on up. You are the people that made this happen, along with the audience here. And so I want everybody to recognize you. Hundreds and hundreds of hours, folks, to put this on. Sorry, I'm blocking it. Put this on. And so we want to thank them all. Stand up. Stand up. And I also want to thank all of you for differentiating yourselves and coming out to this, because I think you'll look back and see that this was a real turning point in your career, and you're going to meet some fabulous people, not only here, you've already done that, but more of them, more in the Globe Foundation, and I hope you use it to your advantage. And I hope we win this battle and push this whole problem forward, right, and solve it, right, because I know you can do it. So.
So I'm gonna steal this opportunity just for 1 second. So throughout today, I guess we've been talking about pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone and making new partnerships and really getting to know your peers today and connecting and hopefully using that network to be able to push forward in your careers and your lives. And it's a shame that they're all leaving behind me right now, because I just wanted to say that I feel like I found my team through this event. They were all really great, even though I'm being abandoned right now. And Dave and Elliot can take all of the credit, I guess. I don't really know. But later on this week, on Thursday, we're going to be talking about the importance of remaining engaged and remaining involved. And I can say definitely that since I've become involved in leading change, shameless plug, my personal and my professional network has expanded exponentially. And I can honestly say that I feel like I have really great people that I've connected with and that I'm going to be able to work on projects with hopefully in the future. So I challenge all of you to make those connections throughout the week, because you really do have the best opportunity to do that. Thanks, everyone.
All right, and with that, you are free. Oh, I'm getting told off. Okay.
So, caveat, I report to Mike. But he honestly, I know that you gave a little synopsis at the beginning of today of sort of the history of leading change and the reason why everyone was here. But I think that you're way too modest, Mike, that a lot of the relationship that we've built with Globe over the years, the fundraising that we've done for this event, the speakers that we're able to bring out, is a lot of it is because of Mike. So I think that Mike deserves a round of applause as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So please do me one thing and find that passion in your life, do it the best you can, and make a difference. Make the world a better place. And go have a beer now. All right?